Rope, it's a humble product. We invented it hundreds of thousands of years ago, and we used it for bow and arrows and other measuring devices. It seems crazy that human beings started building these things so long time ago, and yet they were used by the biggest and most ambitious people in history. The Moors used rope to measure their buildings. So did the Romans, the Greeks, the ancient Egyptians, and the Arabs. The Chinese, of course, and the Mayans. If this humble product is so useful, how come it's never talked about as one of the great inventions, like fire? Not only does this invention draw us together as human beings, but it shows that even the simplest inventions can take us really far if we pay attention. In my opinion, the story of history is lost if you do not think about one of its greatest inventions, trade. The multi-ethnic and multi-pluralistic ideas that come from all over the world that would benefit any kingdom is seen as a low priority by a lot of people in history. In fact, I can't think of one civilization that I would call great that did not benefit from being multi ethnic in its own way, whether it's the Chinese, the Arabs, the Greeks, the Egyptians, or anybody else. In real life, the piece of rope that I use as an analogy shows the transfer of knowledge from one to the other, starting from Africa, being used humbly for bow and arrows, and of course to measure other things that they would invent, like beds and other objects. In ancient Egypt, rope was used in a much more important way. It was used for measuring land. A piece of rope and a square was used to determine how much of the farm or how much of planting land belonged to you and how much taxes you owed and more information like that. It would lend itself to the maths at the time and it would grow. Once rope was used in this way, it would become very important. It would change mathematics forever. In Africa in general, rope was used in various forms of geometry. Of course, this rope, which is still used today in some parts of Africa to measure all kinds of geometry that I have shown before, still show the history of how things just leap at you through geometry. It is impossible to know fully exactly what Africans understood about geometry, but it's apparent in everything they do. It's even possible that through textiles they had some understanding of perspective, let's call it drawing. It's not fully known how deep the geometry of Africa is, but clearly in their cotton that was built prior to any invasion from Middle Easterners or Europeans, they had some level of understanding. The problem is, because of a lack of writing in many parts of Africa, we have to get the information from looking at the geometry itself and then speculating whether you can or can't build this level of sophistication in geometry without or with merely guessing. Because, of course, there were tricks of the trade. These tricks that are building this geometry, though different than some that would be used in the West or in the Middle East, they do not represent a fallen system. Clearly, they work. Clearly, some level of repetition is being used. Clearly, some level of angling has been used. Clearly, you can teach from one person to the other that, okay, so do this, do that. There is repetition, fractals, there is everything in here. Fractals are probably the least interesting thing about this, although it's the most emphasized. If you look at how it gives this digital like image, sort of like an old computer when they were first trying to draw with them, you can see how there is pattern behind them, there is mathematics behind them. It's not even fully understood exactly why they would do this, but taking rope and mixing it with geometric understanding, and this is what you get. The ancient Egyptians, too, would build things like this, of course. They had multiple fashion or multiple clothing that had this. Now, in Africa, we do not limit it to just fashion. Of course, their buildings, whether they were built of sticks or straw or anything else, still obeyed this type of geometry. The untouched civilization of Great Zimbabwe is only but one example that shows both symmetry and zigzag shapes which cannot be guessed, really. These take planning. And of course, there's the chevron shape, which is used all over. According to experts, you could not possibly build Great Zimbabwe without the deep understanding of ellipses, angles, slopes, and all kinds of things that are basically rubbed out of the history of Africa. Luckily, they are preserved in the later things that people would do. Some people value these only for their pretty sight, but what they don't understand is that it takes a lot to do these things. It's not merely looking at something and going, "Oh yeah, isn't that pretty?" I mean, if we look at Japan, we know that they had deep histories of understanding earthquakes and stuff like that. But of course, a lot of these things would not be seen until an earthquake happened and the building stayed standing. In Africa, there too, they would need to be very familiar with their own environment, understanding wind, understanding all kinds of things. One of the things that I didn't even realize existed until a tour was that in Great Zimbabwe, or close to Great Zimbabwe, there was a drainage system, one where it was made for so that rain would not accumulate in one area and basically wash the soil away. And this was by boring holes in some of the buildings and sort of flattening out the building things so that they can act like a pipe. I had no idea. There is something called the intuitive debate, which is in history, a lot of times when they can't figure out how some people did something, they say, oh, they must have had some kind of intuition about how to do it. In real life, that's almost never the case. Whenever people build something, especially something as artificial as a building, there's usually a lot of thought behind it, especially given the fact that some of these buildings, which became ruins, would collapse or fall if the angles were off just a little. Now, here's the blending of intuition mixed with intention. A crucial device that all historians agree is that in order for measuring, there must have been rope. But with rope, you start to see angles. An easy way to do this is to take three pieces of rope. Try this at home. Go get some thread. I'm sure you have some level of rope. You don't need big rope, you don't need anything like that. Just go get a piece of thread, cut them equal. Make sure that they're equal when taut. In other words, if you stretch them to their limit, make sure that they're equal. And then just try to touch all three of the tips while fully taut. Whether you put a stone on the other side, however you use to pin it down so that it doesn't move, and immediately you'll get these angles. Now, of course, getting these angles down on sand is pretty minor and easy. Oh yeah. Secondly, if you take this angle and then you just attach it to another angle of the same triangle and you attach it to another triangle, you get a square. This is how in Angola you get these square houses, some of them made of wood. Even in Congo, before the Europeans arrived, they would have these squares, obviously made of wood, but they would have perfection in them. Speaking of wood, you can see here some pretty interesting patterns on this piece of wood. Uh, the first thing is that they overlap over each other, but not really. They appear to overlap. This is a technique. But this is something that we will explore a little later. What we have to explore now is something that I've already talked about, which is sauna, as it's called in Zambia. This sauna method, obviously, I've mentioned before, is a method for making sure you draw one line drawings. But this technique can also be used to draw squares, triangles, and all kinds of other shapes. Interestingly, some people were fully unaware of how this could have worked, but it worked. And the same sauna method would be used in weaving baskets, the same in making all kinds of wood carvings, drawing on the ground, making sure you place houses. But let's first see how it works. So, as you can see here, there are dots, and those dots seem to be curving around and then bending at an angle. Usually they are curvy because of the purpose. But this time you can see here in drawing the antelope that they are straight. If you want sacred geometry, this is the true sacred geometry. One where you don't really need to calculate numbers, but you still get to the right answers. Now you can see if we look at the one at the bottom that we have two big squares right at the bottom, and they are the same size and overlap over each other. Now, we're not the smartest people in the world, but we can easily see how it would interest us immediately by seeing this. These people invented this, and they too would see this. Placement of these dots could be done by various methods, one of them being the same triangles to create the squares, and then in the middle you use another rope that you put in between and it would do the same thing. But actually, another way of doing it is to put these stakes on the ground, of course. This is in the three dimension. You put stakes in the ground that represent those dots in 3D, and then you wrap rope around it, and this will create these shapes. And then you can sew or knit anything you want in these shapes. Another way to do it is to put a piece of mud or some kind of sticky thing on a piece of clay, on a piece of wood, and then you can carve around it using this method that you've already figured out. These are some of the geometries which some people call intuitive, but they're not intuitive. They're purposefully done. And they're purposefully done because they get the same answer every time. Things can become real interesting with this type of planning and making. But let's not work on that right now. Let's go back to geometry in general and how it placed multi ethnic and multicultural implications all over the world. African geometry has shown to be very different than that was used outside of Africa, except for the very few ideas that were taken from Africa proper and then used outside. One of the biggest mining areas for geometry that went outside of Africa is ancient Egypt. Because they wrote it down, it was easy to transfer from one to another without losing the information due to oral tradition. This papyrus that holds ancient Egyptian wisdom in maths and geometry shows that there is a clear transition from the ancient Greeks and the ancient Egyptians in really all ways when it came to mathematics and everything. And of course, they used it to carve their images as well, the visual images of pharaohs and stuff like that. Something that is easily accepted. Now, had it been in any other place of Africa, they would have said that those carvings were not mathematical, but instead were based on intuition. But because it's in Egypt, they look for the information, they find it, they find out that a lot of those things were cut in certain ways to make it easy to build. Now remember, the genius is ease. The genius is to be able to cut things down and break things down for yourself. Simplicity is king. That's why those methods that I showed you in Africa, that's why they're so impressive. Because you don't have to go deep to understand them. So, of course, this transfers to ancient Greece. Ancient Greece is easily one of the most well known civilizations for what they did, with Euclid geometry and stuff like that. And then, of course, their maths that was kind of janky, to be honest. Of course, they didn't have the number zero, and so didn't the Romans. But later on, the Arabs would grab hold of this because the Arabs were more open to ideas coming from all parts of their kingdoms or their spread of influence because they were not under one kingdom. They took stuff from Africa. Some of the patterns used that you find even amongst the Berbers. And speaking of Berbers, one of the best people to use this practically was Abbas ibn Firnas, someone who is reputed to have flown in Cordoba, Spain, early, way earlier than the Wright brothers. These gliders that were made by this person apply all of this geometric stuff, and then of course it applies some of the stuff that he might have learned from his African background because he was a Moor and his ancestors came from Africa. He, of course, did other things in his life. He was a mathematician in other ways, and he did several other things that people never mention because, of course, the potential of a person flying back in the day seems more important. And of course, the extra maths you have to do to operate in a three-dimensional space is beyond understanding exactly how he pulled this off, especially since we know that he landed pretty harshly. And they described it that he didn't have a tail, so he had a hard landing, which is absolutely true, works out today, which means he probably did glide. Now, there are some rumors that the Saqqara bird of ancient Egypt could glide too, and perhaps maybe the Saqqara bird was a symbol of a previous glider, but it could not glide. In fact, I think in 2023 there was a study that showed that it was impossible. So in ancient Egypt, they didn't have gliders like these. They might have had toys. They could do stuff like this. I know in ancient China, they had toys that were like little helicopter propellers and they could fly. Speaking of China, the Arabs would take I Ching from the Chinese. We also know that the Chinese used the 345 method independently in about 400 BC. Now, this transfer of information was not one directional. It did not move from Africa or China or India or even Europe to Arabia and then stop. Even though it's called the golden age of Islam, which is important, people still think of it like an Arab golden age or a Middle Eastern golden age. But it really was a golden age of Islam because in Spain, you have the Moors creating all kinds of things. In the Swahili coast, you have the people of the Swahili coast creating all kinds of things. In the West African areas, in the Berber regions, and even in China, they're benefiting from the new information coming from the Arabs. We know tons of Arabs, including Black African Arabs, European Arabs, and Middle Eastern Arabs, came to those regions. Something that always strikes me as strange is that you always hear this information that the first European to ever land in China or India is Vasco da Gama or any of those people, but it's not true. Remember, the Moors were in Europe. They were not native in the oldest sense, but they came from Europe, and from Europe they would go to China, a very few number. So it's not like the people of Europe, the white people, discovered a path that had never been taken before. But I'll need to make a dedicated video about this. Let's go back to geometry. What some people don't understand that before the madrasa, which are houses of learning in Arabic culture, the mosques were primarily where a lot of education was done. And as you can see here, in the 11th century in Tanzania, they built a mosque using all types of historical mathematics that were applied. You can see here that the majority of the influence is Islamic, even though it has, first of all, this is built of coral, which was traditionally what these people built their stuff of before the Muslims came in. So this was a addition to what they knew previously. Now, making a mosque and then running away would be a pretty dumb thing to do. So what they did was build palaces, build local settlements around the area, and they utilized these same methods. You can see how brilliantly some of these are made. Something aesthetically pleasing about ruins. But of course, these would have been painted white and they would have looked way more pleasant to the eye than they do now. But it's not about buildings. Remember that these people had books, they had places of learning. Everything that was learned before would have been brought back here. While it's true that in West Africa there was a form of binary. It would have not have been lost to these people that a lot of Africans have binary code, which was then used in Europe. And it would have not been lost on these people that that existed. I mean, these were the natives. The natives knew things that they knew, and they added to this area. Sadly, not a lot of information has been gathered from Tanzania or really Mozambique or any of these places that had written records that showed the sophistication of these lands. Who else could possibly reveal the secrets besides the writers that wrote about these areas? These three buildings utilize both native and Islamic influences. The one at the top, located with trees inside it, is the one in Kilwa, and it used coral, which used to be used for mainly reinforcing mud brick buildings and also creating pathways on the ground like roads that were used by the natives, and of course building some individual dwellings. It later was used in this type of method to create giant temples. The one at the bottom is from Europe, and you can clearly see how they fuse Islamic and European styles. The third one is Chinese. It's a mosque located in China, and clearly the circular thing at the top represents a part of the Islamic world, but in general, it's all Chinese. This shows that not only was it going one direction, but it was going both. And not only was it going both directions, but they benefited heavily from it. Some people say that if this benefit was there, how come when people get to Africa later on, you don't see any of these developments, but instead you see tribesmen and stuff like that? Now, the only way you could say this is if you have no idea what Africa looked like. In reality, Africa was sophisticated and the same as any other place. I mean, starting from right in the beginning. And not only this, there were people from all over the world contributing up until the 1900s. And so to say that their civilizations did not have any sophistication to the level that is similar than any other place is to say that even the foreigners that came to those lands must have been primitive themselves. It makes no sense. This drawing here represents a before and after. This is located in Angola. While doing research for the Kingdom of Congo, I slowly realized that the southern African kingdoms were considered way more sophisticated by the Portuguese when they first landed there. While the Kingdom of Congo might have had some brilliant buildings and brilliant burials and stuff like that, the kingdom or Angola before the Portuguese arrived was a sophisticated place. An example of this is a mud brick building. By the way, they had brick buildings, but we're not talking about that. They're a mud brick building. And to the Europeans, when they first saw it, they thought that it was made of actual brick until, of course, you touch it. In the translation written below, it says, "These are the houses of these countries. They plant in the ground thick posts, forming with them a cage, as can be seen in the figure 3. Then inside and outside they put earth or mud with which they cover all the timber, then they whitewash it, as can be seen in figure 2, so that who doesn't know believes that there are walls in our manner. The roof is always of straw, as can be seen in figure 2. They build this type of houses very rapidly, and they last as long as ours. They are larger or smaller according to the means, but all have one level only. Now, the reason why it's important for me to add some of these in a place where I'm talking about measurements and stuff like that is because you cannot get these without measurements. But on top of that, they become cruder and cruder as time goes on. It seems like the earliest versions of them were better. Why does this matter? Well, because the way that a lot of Africans are taught, especially myself, is that these types of structures were a fusion between Western and the African hut. But as you can see, the African hut is a far cry from this type of building. Of course, as well, they said there were no doors in Africa. Yeah. In contrast, Africans had a pivot door, a door that usually had a one metal thing, rod, that would be attached and it would swing. In some cases, there were sliding doors, but that was also very rare. In the other pictures that I've shown you, there were some which were just placed on the area where it would be a door. But this, again, would be very rare and usually for the very poor. The disrespect that Africa has taken over the years, given how much historical written record there is about how sophisticated they are, is sickening. I haven't said half the stuff that I wanted to say, but this video is going to be way too long. So like, share, subscribe, and other things.